ballroom glittered under the golden light of massive crystal chandeliers, each drop of glass catching and scattering light like diamonds. Waiters in crisp white shirts glided between tables, refilling champagne flutes and offering trays of hors d'oeuvres topped with delicate garnishes. At the far edge of the room, away from the laughter and the clinking glasses, Mark worked quietly. His janitor's uniform looked stark and out of place among the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, but he kept his head down, collecting empty glasses and stacking chairs with practiced efficiency. Near the grand piano in the center of the stage, a group of young executives lounged in their seats, clearly a little bored. Their conversation drifted just loud enough for Mark to hear snippets. Complaints about speeches, jokes about the cheap wine. One of them noticed Mark and, with a smirk, nudged the others. "Hey, let's see if the janitor can play," he said, pointing toward the piano with exaggerated flair. The group laughed, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to invite but to embarrass. Mark froze mid-step, his hands gripping the back of a chair. He'd been mocked before, sometimes subtly, sometimes blatantly, but the sound of that laughter burned. For a moment, he considered pretending he hadn't heard. Yet something inside him shifted. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was the stubborn spark that refused to let others define him. Without a word, he set down the glasses he was holding, walked slowly toward the stage, and lowered himself onto the piano bench. The room grew quieter, not respectful but curious, waiting to see the janitor show. Mark let his fingers hover over the ivory keys, feeling the faint coolness of the smooth surface. The piano smelled faintly of polished wood and history, like it had witnessed decades of performances more glamorous than the one they were expecting from him. The hum of conversation dimmed further, replaced by the occasional rustle of silk gowns and the faint clink of cutlery from the dinner tables. In his mind, he was no longer in the ballroom. He was back in the tiny living room of his old apartment, sunlight spilling through lace curtains, his late wife leaning against the doorway with a soft smile as he played. He could almost hear her humming along, see his baby daughter curled up on the couch, eyes drifting shut to the music. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memory was so vivid it tightened his chest. One of the executives in the back let out a snicker, clearly expecting a clumsy, awkward attempt at music. "Come on, janitor, don't keep us waiting," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. A ripple of amusement passed through a few guests, but Mark didn't look up. He took a slow breath, letting the noise fade into the background. The truth was, he hadn't touched a piano in years. Not because he'd lost the ability, but because it hurt too much. Still, the muscle memory tingled in his fingertips, waiting to be released. Tonight, he decided he wouldn't play for them. He would play for her. And for himself. The first note rang out like a drop of water in a silent cave. Soft, clear, and impossibly still. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment before melting into the next, and then the next, until a fragile melody began to unfurl. The sound was gentle at first, like a whisper meant only for those who leaned close enough to listen. Slowly, the murmurs and shifting chairs stopped altogether. Mark's hands moved with a grace that didn't match his rough, work-worn fingers. They glided over the keys, coaxing out chords that shimmered and ached all at once. The music swelled, each note pulling invisible threads that seemed to bind the entire room in quiet reverence. Guests who moments ago were scrolling through their phones or chatting idly now found themselves leaning forward, eyes fixed on the man at the piano. The melody shifted, deepening into something richer, a blend of longing and warmth that seemed to tell a story without words. A story of love that had been lost but never forgotten. There was power in it, but also vulnerability, as if Mark was opening a door to a room in his heart no one had seen in years. Even the group of executives who had laughed earlier sat motionless, their expressions softening. One woman pressed her fingers lightly to her lips, as if afraid to disturb the moment. The golden light from the chandeliers spilled over the piano, catching the faint shine in Mark's eyes as he played, not looking at the audience, but at a memory only he could see. By now, no one in the ballroom heard a janitor playing. They simply heard the music. The final chord lingered in the air like the last breath of a dream, vibrating gently before dissolving into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was as if the room itself was reluctant to break whatever spell had just been cast. Mark's hands rested lightly on the keys, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow exhale. He hadn't realized until now how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap, slow, deliberate. It was the CEO. His usually stern face, the kind that could silence an entire boardroom with a glance, was softened, his eyes glistening under the chandelier light. He rose to his feet, and the sound of his applause grew louder, fuller, until it was joined by dozens more. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into a standing ovation. Mark blinked, caught between disbelief and a quiet, humbling warmth that swelled in his chest. People were no longer looking at him with curiosity or amusement. They looked at him with something like respect, maybe even admiration. The same executives who had mocked him earlier now stood clapping, their smug expressions replaced with something more thoughtful, almost ashamed. A waiter who had been lingering near the wall leaned in toward another staff member and whispered, "I've never heard anything like that in here." In the corner of the room, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her shoulders trembling as if she'd just been reminded of someone she loved. As the applause roared on, Mark finally lifted his gaze from the keys and offered a small, almost shy nod. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. When the applause finally began to fade, the CEO stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking against the stage floor. Up close, Mark could see the fine lines etched into the man's face, the ones that didn't come from frowning at balance sheets, but from living through moments that left their mark. The CEO extended his hand, and Mark, still seated, hesitated before taking it. The handshake was firm, steady, nothing condescending, nothing staged for the crowd. "That," the CEO said, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity, "was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in this room." The ballroom, now hushed again, seemed to hang on his words. "We talk so much about success here, numbers, deals, growth. But tonight, you reminded us what really matters." He gestured toward the nearest table. "Join us for dinner, as our guest." The room murmured in surprise. Guests shifted to make space, and someone pulled out a chair at the CEO's table. Mark stood slowly, feeling all eyes on him. But this time, their gaze didn't feel heavy or judging. It felt warm. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man cleaning up after the party. Later that night, Mark unlocked the door to his modest apartment. The warm scent of microwaved macaroni drifted from the kitchen, and his daughter came running to greet him, her socks sliding on the floor. She threw her arms around his waist. "How was work, Dad?" she asked, looking up with curious eyes. Mark smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Let's just say," he said softly, "I played a little music today." He glanced toward the corner where an old, dust-covered keyboard sat. Maybe it was time to bring it back to life.